The day Hazel Bell rode into Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory, the summer of 1883, she arrived with nothing but a worn leather satchel, a broken-down mare named Cinnamon, and the kind of quiet determination that made men step aside and women whisper behind their hands. She had not intended to stop in Redemption Creek. She had intended to pass straight through it on her way to Santa Fe, where a cousin of hers had written promising work at a respectable boarding house. But Cinnamon had thrown a shoe somewhere between the last dry creek bed and the town's single unpaved main street, and so Hazel had walked the last 2 miles in the afternoon heat with the mare limping beside her, dust coating her brown boots and the hem of her calico dress, her straw hat barely keeping the furious sun off her face. The town was small but not dying. There was a livery stable, a general store with a hand-painted sign that had faded to near illegibility, a saloon called the Copper Penny, a post office the size of a large closet, and a whitewashed building that served as both the church and the schoolhouse on alternating days of the week. A blacksmith shop stood at the far end of the street, and it was toward this that Hazel walked, speaking softly to Cinnamon as they went. The blacksmith was a wide-shouldered Mexican man named Abelardo who looked at the mare's foot and sucked air through his teeth in a way that told Hazel the news before he even opened his mouth. "She has been walking on the bare hoof a good while," he said, crouching low and turning the hoof gently in his calloused hands. "The frog is bruised. She needs rest and new shoes, but mostly rest. Maybe 4-5 days before I would put her on a hard road again." Hazel let out a long, slow breath. She looked down the street at the town and then at the sky and then at the mare and then at her own hands. "How much for the shoeing?" she asked. 75 cents for the shoes," Abelardo said. "The rest is time I can give you, but the mare will need to stay." "I understand." She paid him from a small tin she kept inside her satchel, and then she asked where a woman traveling alone might find a room that was clean and not too dear. Abelardo scratched the back of his neck. "Mrs. Dunmore takes boarders on the east side," he said, "but she is full up right now. There is the hotel, but it costs more than it is worth. And then there is," he paused and gave her a measuring look, the way a man looks at someone when he is trying to decide whether to say something that might sound unusual. "There is the Trask Ranch about 4 miles out. Matthew Trask sometimes takes in travelers when there is a need. He has a big house and not much in it." "Does he charge fare?" Hazel asked. "He does not charge anything at all, mostly," Abelardo said, "but he will likely tell you the place is no good for a decent woman. He says that to everybody. He is not a bad man. He is just a man who has been alone too long and thinks his solitude has made him rough." Hazel considered this information with the practical mind of a woman who had spent the last 14 months traveling the territories alone, who had slept in a wagon bed during a hailstorm outside Amarillo, who had nursed her own blistered feet in the red dust of the Texas Panhandle, and who had once talked a drunk cowboy out of stealing her horse using nothing but a firm voice and a cast-iron frying pan held with both hands. "Point me in the right direction," she said. The road to the Trask Ranch was not really a road. It was 2 wheel ruts worn into the earth by years of a single wagon making the same trip back and forth to town. It cut through a stretch of low sage and juniper, and climbed a gentle rise before opening onto a wide flat valley, where a creek ran silver in the late afternoon light, and tall cottonwood trees stood in a ragged line along its banks. The house sat back from the creek, a long low structure of adobe and timber with a covered porch running along its front. Behind it were a large barn, a corral where 3 horses stood watching the approaching stranger, and several outbuildings in various states of repair. Hazel stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the place for a moment. It was not an ugly ranch. It had bones. The main house had clearly been built by someone who knew what they were doing, and the porch was wide and solid. But there was a general air of a place that was being kept alive without any particular joy. The garden that might once have grown along the south side of the house was now just a patch of dry ground. The porch railing had lost a spindle somewhere, and no one had replaced it. The curtains in the front window were the color of old flour sacks. A man came around the corner of the barn before she reached the porch steps. He was tall and lean, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that was several days past needing a razor. He wore canvas work trousers and a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and his forearms were the brown of someone who worked outside every day of his life. He stopped when he saw her, and the expression on his face was not unwelcoming, but it was not welcoming either. It was simply the expression of a man who had not expected company and was working out what to do about its arrival. "Mr. Trask," Hazel said, stopping at a polite distance. "That's right," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, and even in those two words she could hear that he was a careful speaker, a man who did not waste language. "My name is Hazel Bell. My horse threw a shoe and Abelardo at the livery says she needs several days of rest before she can travel. He thought you might be able to put me up for a few nights. I can work for my keep if you need it." Matthew Trask looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the house as if seeing it fresh through her eyes. "Miss Bell," he said, "I appreciate you coming all the way out here, but I have to be straight with you. This house is not fit for decent company. I am a bachelor and I keep a bachelor's house, and there is nobody here but me and two ranch hands who sleep in the bunkhouse and spend their evenings in ways that are not suitable to describe to a lady. I eat out of the pan when it suits me, and there are more saddle blankets than actual blankets, and I cannot in good conscience tell you it would be comfortable." He said all of this in a level tone, without embarrassment and without cruelty. He was simply describing a reality. Hazel Bell looked at him. She looked at the house. She thought about the 2 miles she had walked in the heat with a lame horse, and she thought about the hotel in town that Abelardo had said cost more than it was worth, and she thought about the 4 miles she would have to walk back through the sage and the juniper in the early evening, and then she made up her mind. She walked up the porch steps, lifted the iron latch on the front door, and stepped inside. The interior of the house was exactly what Matthew had described. It was not filthy, but it was the kind of disordered, stripped-back space that a man lives in when he has stopped noticing his surroundings. There was a long pine table with one end covered in papers and harness leather, and a coffee cup that had been there long enough to leave a ring. There were mismatched chairs, a cook stove with ash caked around its base, a shelf of canned goods and dusty bottles, a bedroll on a cot in the corner that was presumably for visitors, though it looked like it had not been used in years. A fireplace with a fine stone mantel that someone had carved with small running horses, and this detail more than anything told Hazel that the house had not always been like this. Someone had once cared enough to put beauty into that mantel. Someone had once imagined that this room would hold people who noticed things. She set her satchel down on the nearest chair and turned to face Matthew Trask, who had followed her inside and was standing in the doorway with the look of a man who is not sure whether he has just witnessed something remarkable or something alarming. "I have seen rougher," she said simply, and sat down at the pine table. There was a long silence. Then Matthew Trask's mouth did something that was almost, not quite, but almost a smile. He came the rest of the way into the house and let the door fall closed behind him. "Can I offer you water?" he said. "Or coffee? The coffee is old." "Coffee," said Hazel Bell. "Thank you." He filled the pot from a clay jug and set it on the stove, and they did not speak while the stove heated up, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have both learned to be economical with themselves, and who are, perhaps for the first time in a long while, not entirely alone. Hazel looked at the fireplace mantel while the coffee heated. She studied the carved horses, their manets flowing backward, their legs caught mid-gallop, the stone around them worn smooth from years of hands passing over it. "Who carved that?" she asked. Matthew turned from the stove and looked at the mantel as if he had stopped seeing it long ago. "My father," he said, after a pause that suggested it was not a subject he had discussed recently. "It is beautiful work," Hazel said. "He was a patient man." "And you?" she asked. She was not being impertinent. She was simply the kind of woman who asked direct questions, because she had found it saved a great deal of wasted time. Matthew looked at her then, really looked at her, and his expression shifted slightly into something more considered. "I used to be," he said. "I am working on it again." He poured the coffee into 2 chipped mugs and brought them to the table and sat down across from her, and if either of them thought there was anything unusual about the situation, neither gave any sign of it. The 2 ranch hands, a young Mexican named Ernesto and an older drifter everyone called Pigeon on account of a crooked nose, came in from the bunkhouse around supper time and stopped dead in the doorway when they saw Hazel Bell at the table with a dish towel over her shoulder, frying salt pork in Matthew's cast-iron skillet. She had found the larder. She had found the cornmeal and the salt pork and some dried beans that she had set to soak, and she had applied herself to making supper with the practical efficiency of a woman for whom cooking in strange kitchens was simply something that happened in life. "Evening," she said to Ernesto and Pigeon, as calm as if she had lived there for years. They looked at Matthew. Matthew shrugged. "Miss Bell will be staying a few nights," he said. "Her horse needs rest. She says she can cook. I have not argued with that." Ernesto took off his hat. Pigeon took off his hat. They sat down at the table like men who have suddenly remembered that they know how to have manners. The supper was good. It was better than anything that had come out of Matthew Trask's kitchen in recent memory, and he noticed this without saying it aloud, but he noticed it the way you notice when the air changes before a rainstorm, a full-body awareness of something shifting. After supper, Hazel washed the dishes in the basin and Matthew dried them without being asked, which seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised anyone else. Ernesto and Pigeon retreated to the bunkhouse. The night came down cool and blue outside the windows, and the cottonwoods along the creek rustled with a small wind. "I will sleep out here on the cot," Hazel said, nodding toward the bedroll in the corner. "I will not impose on your room." "There is a second bedroom," Matthew said. "It is a bit. I have seen rougher," Hazel said, which was becoming, without either of them planning it, a kind of refrain. He showed her the second bedroom. It was a narrow room with a rope bed and a mattress that had seen better days and a window that looked out over the horse corral. There was a hook on the wall and an old braided rug on the floor, and these 2 things, the hook and the rug, were touches of someone's domestic intention, and they made the room feel less abandoned than it might have otherwise. "It was meant to be a guest room," Matthew said from the doorway, with something in his voice that was not quite apology and not quite grief, but sat somewhere between the 2. Hazel set her satchel on the bed and turned around. "Then let it be 1, she said. Matthew Trask looked at Hazel Bell in the dim light of the narrow room with the sound of the creek, just audible through the window, and the smell of the supper she had cooked still faint in the air, and he thought that he could not have explained, not to anyone, not even to himself, why the sight of this stranger standing calmly in his neglected house felt like something coming back that he had long ago given up on. He said good night. He went to his own room. He did not sleep for a considerable time. The following morning Hazel was up before the sun. She was the kind of woman who had learned to treat daylight as a resource not to be wasted, and she had the coffee made and the fire going by the time Matthew came out of his room with sleep still on his face and his dark hair unruly. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her and looked at the coffee and looked at the clean, organized state of the kitchen, which she had quietly tidied after supper, and which now bore little resemblance to the room he had been ignoring for the past several years. "You did not have to do all that," he said. "I told you I would work for my keep," she said. "Sit down, there are eggs. I found them in the nest by the barn. Your hens are not getting enough to eat, by the way. The shells are thin." Matthew sat down. "I know, I need to get more grain into town, I keep forgetting." "Add it to a list," Hazel said, setting a plate in front of him. "Lists are useful things." He picked up his fork and then looked at her. "Are you always this organized at dawn?" "When I have something to organize," she said, and sat down across from him with her own plate, and there was something in the easy naturalness of that gesture, the simple act of two people sitting down together to share a meal in the morning light that settled over the kitchen like warmth. He asked her where she was headed, and she told him about Santa Fe and her cousin and the boarding house. "Do you know your cousin well?" he asked. "Not very well," Hazel admitted. "We corresponded. She seems like a sensible woman. She says there is steady work and the boarding house is respectable." And before Santa Fe, he was not being intrusive. He was asking the way a man asks when he is genuinely interested in the answer. Hazel was quiet for a moment, considering what to tell and what to keep. "I grew up in Georgia," she said at last. "After the war things were difficult. My parents died when I was 19. First my father and then my mother, 6 months apart. I had an aunt in Memphis, and then I had a period of working at a hotel in Abilene, Kansas. And then things moved along as they do, and here I am." She said it all very matter-of-factly, without self-pity, and yet it was a story of considerable loss told in a very few words, and Matthew heard all of it, including the parts she had not said. "I am sorry about your parents," he said. "I am also sorry about them," she said simply. "Every day. But life keeps going whether you are ready or not." "It does," he agreed, with a weight in his voice that told her he spoke from his own knowledge of that particular truth. They finished their eggs. Outside, the sun was coming up over the eastern hills, and the light was coming in slanted and golden through the window, and Ernesto and Pigeon could be heard moving around in the yard, and the horses in the corral were calling to each other in their low, rumbling way. "What do you do out here?" Hazel asked. "What does the ranch run?" "Cattle mostly," Matthew said. "Some horses. I have about 300 head of cattle on the south pasture and another 150 in the canyon land west of here. Just me and Ernesto and Pigeon most of the year. In fall, I hire 2 more men for the drive to Las Vegas." "Las Vegas, New Mexico," she said, to clarify she understood he did not mean the Nevada town. "That is right, the railhead, they drive from there east." He paused. "It is a good operation, not as big as I planned when I started it, but solid enough." "When did you start it?" "I came out here in 1872, he said. "I was 23. I had a quarter section from my father and a loan from a bank in Albuquerque and more confidence than sense." She smiled at that. It was the first full smile she had given him, and it changed her face in a way that made him set down his coffee cup without noticing he had done it. "And yet here you are with 300 head and a house with a carved fireplace," she said. "And yet here I am," he agreed, and something about the echo of her phrasing made him smile back, and they sat there for a moment, both of them smiling, which was something neither of them had expected to be doing this morning. He showed her around the ranch after breakfast. He was not a man who gave tour under ordinary circumstances, but she asked sensible questions about the cattle and the water rights and the layout of the land, and he found himself explaining things he had not explained to anyone in years because there had been no one to explain them to. She knew something about cattle. She had apparently spent time in Kansas during the great cattle drives and had absorbed the working knowledge of ranching by proximity, by watching and listening and remembering. The south pasture was in good condition, the grass coming up well from the spring rains, the cattle fat and easy in the warm morning. The creek ran through the lower end of the property, reliable water that had never gone dry in Matthew's 11 years on the land, and he spoke of this with a particular pride, the pride of a man who has chosen his ground well. At the corral, Hazel stopped to look at the 3 horses. There was a big blue roan gelding that was clearly Matthew's own horse, a solid working animal with a calm eye, and 2 cow ponies that Ernesto and Pigeon used. She stood at the fence for a while without speaking, and the roan came over and pushed his nose at her hand. "His name is Butte," Matthew said. "That is a dignified name for a horse," she said, stroking the broad flat of the horse's nose. "He is a dignified animal," Matthew said, and the easy warmth in his voice when he spoke about the horse told her something more about him than anything else had so far. The day moved the way good days in June move in New Mexico, slowly and fully, the light rich and the air dry, and carrying the smell of sage and warm earth. Hazel helped Ernesto mend a section of fence on the east side of the property, while Matthew and Pigeon rode out to check on the canyon pasture. Ernesto was a young man of about 20, shy in the presence of a woman but fundamentally decent. And after the first quiet hour of fence work, he began to talk a little, carefully, about his family in the village of Ojo Caliant, and about how he had been with Matthew Trask for 3 years, and how Matthew was a fair employer who paid on time and never asked a man to do something he would not do himself. Hazel listened and worked the wire with the practiced ease of someone who had done physical work all her life. She wore her sleeves rolled up and her hat pulled low, and she used the fence pliers without fumbling, and Ernesto watched this out of the corner of his eye with visible respect. "He has been alone a long time," Ernesto said at one point without looking at her, driving a new post with a heavy mallet. Hazel looked up. "I gathered that," she said. "His wife died," Ernesto said, "before I came here, but I hear from Pigeon that it was a bad time. The house was different after that, Pigeon says." Hazel was quiet for a moment. She thought about the guest room that was meant to be a guest room. She thought about the garden that had been a garden once. "What was her name?" she asked. "Clara," said Ernesto. Hazel nodded and went back to the fence, and she held the name Clara in her mind with the careful respect you give to the memory of someone who has mattered to someone else, and she did not say anything more about it. When Matthew came back in the late afternoon, he found Hazel at the south end of the porch with a bucket of whitewash she had apparently discovered in the barn, painting the lower half of the porch railing. She had replaced the missing spindle with a length of straight juniper branch she had whittled to approximate shape with a small knife she carried in her satchel. Matthew got down from Butte and stood there looking at the spindle. "That is not the correct shape," he said. "No," she agreed, not pausing in her whitewashing, "but it fills the gap and it will hold. You can replace it properly when you get into town." He looked at the spindle for another moment. "Where did you find a knife?" "I carry one," she said. "You carry a knife." "And a small pistol," she said pleasantly. "And a copy of the King James Bible and a bottle of laudanum I have had for 3 years and never opened, kept for emergencies, and a second pair of stockings." A woman traveling alone in the territories keeps what she needs. Matthew Trask looked at Hazel Bell crouching on his porch with a whitewash brush and the long afternoon light in her hair, which was the color of new-turned earth, dark brown with an almost copper warmth, coming loose from its pins in the way hair does when the day has been long and physical, and he had the sudden, disorienting sensation of looking at something he wanted to keep looking at for a very long time. "I will put Butte up and then wash before supper," he said, which was not at all what he had been thinking, but it was the thing he could say. That evening after supper, with the dishes washed and the last of the light dying on the western ridge, they sat on the newly whitewashed porch in 2 wooden chairs, and Matthew told her about the winter of 1880, when a blizzard had come down from the north, and he had lost 40 head in 3 days and had to dig a way through 6 feet of drift to reach the barn. He told it plainly, without drama, but with the telling came the sense of a man who had weathered considerable things alone, and who was slightly surprised to find himself recounting them to someone who was listening with full attention. Hazel told him about the hotel in Abilene, about a woman she had met there named Dolers who had been traveling to California to find her son, and who had run out of money in Kansas and had taken work at the hotel alongside Hazel, and how the two of them had become friends of the deep and immediate kind that lonely people sometimes become, and how Dolers had eventually gotten to California by stages, and how they still wrote letters. "You are a person who makes friends," Matthew observed. "I am a person who notices people," Hazel said. "It amounts to the same thing sometimes." The stars came up over the desert with the abundance that stars have in the territorial sky, thick and white and unmediated by any city light, and they sat in the chairs on the porch and talked for another hour without either of them noting the passage of time, until the coyotes started up somewhere on the ridge and the sound of them reminded Hazel that the hour was late. "I should go in," she said, rising. Matthew rose also, because that was how he had been raised, and for a moment they stood facing each other on the porch with the coyote song above them and the creek murmuring down in the dark below. And Hazel looked at his face in the starlight and thought that it was a good face, a careful and honest face, the kind of face that had borne things without becoming hardened by them, and she thought she was in danger of having feelings she had not planned on having. "Good night, Mr. Trask," she said. "Matthew," he said, "please." "Good night, Matthew," she said, and went inside. She lay on the rope bed in the narrow room and listened to the creek and thought about Abilene and Santa Fe and Cinnamon and the cousin she barely knew, and she thought about a man's hands tanned to the wrist where his rolled-up sleeves ended, and carved horses on a stone mantle, and she made a very firm decision to remember that she had a destination and a plan, and that 4 days in Redemption Creek was not the same as a life. She woke to the sound of shouting. It was not panicked shouting. It was the concentrated shouting of men working quickly in a crisis, and she was out of bed and had her boots on before she was fully awake, and when she opened the door Matthew was already going past in the hallway with his hat on and his rifle in his hand. "Fence is down on the east pasture," he said without stopping. "Cattle are into the Johnson wheat." He was out the door before she could respond. She heard Ernesto and Pigeon already on horses. She looked at the situation for the space of 2 heartbeats, and then she went to the barn. She knew how to ride. She had not mentioned this, but she knew how to ride, and she saddled one of the cow ponies with efficient hands, an animal named Chestnut who was agreeable and responsive, and she came out into the early pre-dawn gray and found Matthew already mounted on Butte with his face set and Ernesto and Pigeon spreading out toward the east pasture. Matthew looked at her on the pony and opened his mouth and then closed it again. "Which direction?" she said. He pointed east, and then he rode, and she rode after him. The cattle had gotten through a section of down fence into old Herman Johnson's wheat field, which bordered the Trask ranch on the east, and Johnson himself was standing at his fence line in his nightshirt, and a hat with a lantern in one hand and considerable fury in his voice. He was a stout German settler of about 60 who had been farming that land since 1875, and he had very firm feelings about livestock in his wheat. "Trask," he hollered. "You get those damn animals out of my field right now." "Working on it, Herman," Matthew called back, already moving Butte into the wheat to push the cattle toward the break in the fence. The roundup of scattered cattle in a dark wheat field at 4 in the morning was exactly as complicated as it sounds. The cattle were not inclined to be gathered, and the wheat was knee-high on a horse, and the footing was uneven, and Johnson's lantern was not providing adequate light for the purpose. Ernesto worked the left flank with the quiet expertise of a man who had been doing this work since childhood, making small whistling sounds and guiding his horse with his knees, his reins barely moving. Hazel came up on the right side of a cluster of 3 steers that were moving deeper into the field and did exactly the right thing, pushing wide first to block their path and then angling them back without rushing them. And the steers went where she wanted them because she understood that cattle are moved by pressure and release, and that if you know where you want them to go, you have to block the places you do not want them first. Matthew saw this from across the field, and something in him shifted again, that deep subterranean movement, like water finding a new channel underground. It took an hour. Johnson lost perhaps a 1/4 acre of wheat, which was better than it might have been, and Matthew would later send him a payment for the loss, as was right. By the time the last steer was back through the repaired gap in the fence and Ernesto was driving the final staples into a new post in the pink light of early morning, everyone was dusty and bitten by whatever lived in the wheat, and Herman Johnson had gone back to his house with the satisfied grimness of a man who has been vindicated. They rode back to the ranch in the risen sun, quiet and tired. Pigeon was nursing a bruised hand where a steer had caught him against a fence post. Ernesto was humming something to himself. Matthew rode beside Hazel without speaking for a while. "You have done that before," he finally said. "Cattle are cattle," she said. "Where did you learn?" "Abilene," she said. and before that a little from a man who was briefly my neighbor in Georgia, who ran the only cows that survived the war on our road. I used to watch him work them." Matthew looked at her. The sun was coming up fully now, and it was catching the copper in her hair, and she was sitting the cow pony like she was born to it, and her face was calm and a little tired, and there was wheat chaff on her sleeve. "Miss Bell," he said, and then stopped. She looked at him, waiting. "Hazel," he said, which was the first time he had used her given name. "That was good work." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at the road ahead. "Thank you," she said. They had breakfast again together, all four of them this time, and it was a more expansive and easy meal than any had been before, because shared work and shared difficulty have a way of burning through formality faster than almost anything else. Pigeon told a story about a cattle drive he had been on in 1875 that involved a stampede and a creek crossing and a tent full of playing cards, and managed to be both implausible and entirely believable at the same time. Ernesto laughed, and Matthew laughed, and Hazel laughed, and the sound of laughter in that kitchen was something that Pigeon would later tell anyone who would listen had changed the air in the place, though he would not have put it in those words exactly. Hazel went to visit Cinnamon that afternoon, walking the 4 miles into town with a light step because the morning had been good, and the day was beautiful, and she was carrying something she could not name but which had lightened her considerably. Abelardo reported that the mare was eating well, and the bruising was responding to rest, and that she should be fine to travel in another 2 days. 2 days. Hazel stood in the livery stable with her hand on Cinnamon's neck and thought about 2 days. She walked back to the ranch. She walked back to the Trask ranch, which is to say, she turned away from the direction of Santa Fe and toward the direction of the Trask ranch, and she did not examine this decision too carefully, because she thought if she examined it she might make the wrong one. Matthew was at the porch when she returned, replacing the juniper spindle with a proper turned piece of wood he had apparently found somewhere in the barn. He had his tools out and was fitting it carefully, and he looked up when she came into the yard. "How is she?" he asked, meaning the horse. "Abelardo says 2 more days," Hazel said. He nodded. He went back to the spindle, fitting it into its socket. "Good," he said. "That is good." There was a lot in the word good. There was the straightforward good that meant the horse was healing as expected, and there was another good underneath it that neither of them was ready to address yet, but that was sitting there plain as anything in the late afternoon air. She stood by the porch watching him work. He worked carefully, without hurry, the same patience his father must have brought to carving those horses in the stone. She thought about what Ernesto had said about his wife, about the name Clara. "Matthew," she said. He looked up. "I am sorry about your wife," she said. "I heard from Ernesto. I am sorry I did not say so before. It was only that I did not want to presume." He held the spindle in his hands and looked at her for a long moment, and there was something crossing his face that was old grief and something else, something newer, moving through the grief like weather. "Clara died in 1880, he said. "Fever. It was February and the doctor could not get through the snow for 3 days, and by then he stopped. By then it was too late. I am very sorry," Hazel said. "She would have liked you," he said, and this was clearly something that surprised him to say because he looked slightly taken aback by his own words. "She was a very practical woman. She would have appreciated the fence repair." Hazel smiled gently. "That is a kind thing to say." "It is a true thing," he said. He fitted the spindle into place and pressed it firmly. She was also the kind of person who organized other people's kitchens without being asked, now that I think about it. They looked at each other. "I hope that is not unwelcome," Hazel said. "It is the least unwelcome thing that has happened to me in some time," Matthew Trask said, and he meant the kitchen and he meant everything else, and she understood both meanings, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, and the evening settled around them soft and warm. He cooked supper that night. She had not asked him to, and he had not announced it. He had simply gone to the kitchen while she sat on the porch writing a letter to her cousin in Santa Fe, and an hour later there was a stew of beans and dried beef, and some herbs from a clay pot on the windowsill that she had not noticed before. It was not as good as what she would have made, but it was solid and warm, and it had been made with an intention that she felt in every spoonful. "You have herbs on the windowsill," she observed. "Rosemary," he said. "I keep it because—" He paused, and she could see him deciding whether to continue. "Clara planted it. It keeps coming back." Hazel looked at the little clay pot with its sprig of hardy gray-green herb. "Rosemary is a hardy plant," she said softly. "It does not give up easily." "No," said Matthew, "it does not." The third morning she walked out early to find Matthew in the south pasture moving the cattle to better grass, working alone because Ernesto had taken the wagon to town for supplies, and Pigeon was mending tack in the barn. She caught Chestnut in the corral and went out to help without discussion, and they worked the pasture together for 2 hours in the morning cool, moving the herd in a wide arc to the better grass near the creek. And they worked well together, which is a thing that matters between people. After the cattle were settled, she rode alongside him back toward the barn, and he said, without preamble, "I keep thinking about what happens when Cinnamon is healed." Hazel looked at the space between Chestnut's ears. "Santa Fe is a good city," Matthew said. He said this in the tone of a man who is presenting evidence for a case he does not wish to make. "The boarding house sounds like steady work. Your cousin sounds sensible." "She does," Hazel agreed. "And you have been planning this for a long while." "I have." He was quiet. They reached the barn and dismounted and began unsaddling in silence, the comfortable working silence they had already established between them. "I would ask you to stay," Matthew said, his back to her as he hung Butte's saddle on its peg. "But I am not sure I have the right to ask it, and I do not want to put you in a position that is uncomfortable." He turned around. His expression was entirely direct, the expression of a man who had decided to say the true thing even at the cost of difficulty. "I know you have been here 3 days, and that is not enough time for anyone to know anyone, sensibly speaking. But I have not had 3 days like these 3 days in more than 3 years, and I think you know what that means, and I think you might be feeling something similar, and I would rather say it plainly than let you ride to Santa Fe on a repaired horse and wonder for the rest of my life what I should have said." Hazel Bell stood in the barn with a bridle in her hands and looked at Matthew Trask, who was standing with his hands at his sides and his eyes steady. And she thought about 14 months of moving, of Abilene and Amarillo and the dusty panhandle roads and the cousin she barely knew. And she thought about carved horses on a stone mantel and a sprig of rosemary on a windowsill and a man who replaced porch spindles carefully and laughed at Pigeon's improbable stories and knew his cattle and worked his land with a daily devotion that was itself a kind of love. "You are right that 3 days is not very long," she said. "No," he agreed. "And you are right that I have been feeling something similar." He exhaled very slowly, the way a man exhales when he has been holding his breath without knowing it. "But I do not think I can simply stay as a guest indefinitely," she said. "That would not be right or proper, and I will not stay as anything less than what I am." "I would not ask you to," Matthew said, and there was a fierceness in his voice that was not anger but something very close to its opposite. "I am not asking you to be anything less than what you are. I am asking you to let me court you properly, if you will allow it, and to consider that this ranch and this house and this valley might be worth staying for. And I am saying it plainly because I think you are a woman who appreciates plainness." Hazel looked at him for a long time. Then she hung the bridle on its hook. "Properly," she said. "Properly," he confirmed. "Then," she said, "I suppose I should write my cousin and explain the delay." Matthew Trask's face, which was ordinarily a composed and careful face, broke open into a smile of such genuine and uncomplicated joy that it remade itself entirely, and Hazel thought that she had been right about his face. It was an honest face, and when it was happy it showed its happiness the way a landscape shows weather. You could not miss it. She wrote to her cousin Martha in Santa Fe that evening, a long, careful letter explaining that she had encountered an unexpected circumstance in a small town called Redemption Creek, and that she expected to be delayed, but that she would write again soon. Martha wrote back, 2 weeks later, to say that the position at the boarding house could wait, and that if a man in New Mexico had managed to make Hazel Bell change her plans, she wished to hear everything about him, because Hazel was not a woman who changed her plans for nothing. Hazel was not a woman who changed her plans for nothing. The next 2 weeks were a careful and vivid education in each other. Matthew showed her the full extent of the ranch, the canyon pasture to the west where the cattle grazed in the shade of the red rock walls, the spring on the north hillside that fed the creek, the high meadow above the spring where the grass was so rich and green it looked like it had been planted for the purpose, though it was entirely wild. He showed her these things with the pride of a man showing something he loves, and she received them with the attention of a woman who understands that the things a person loves are the keys to the person. She told him about Georgia, about the red clay fields and the tall pines and the white columns of the old plantation house 3 miles down the road from her father's modest farm, and how after the war everything had changed. The plantation house burned and the old order dissolved, and her father trying to make the farm work in a world that had shifted on its axis. She told him about her father's hands and her mother's voice and the specific quality of Georgia summer nights that she had never encountered anywhere else in her travels, full of heat and noise from the insects and the smell of honeysuckle. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "I miss what it was before," she said honestly. "The actual place it became after I do not miss, but the version of it that lived in my memory before the grief got into it, yes, I miss that. I understand that kind of missing," he said. They were sitting by the creek when she told him this, on a flat rock in the shade of a big cottonwood, the water running clear and cold over the pebbles below them, and he was close enough that she could see the individual shades of brown and green in his eyes, which she had not noticed before, and the way the afternoon light treated his face with a particular quality of attention. "What do you miss?" she asked. "From before?" He thought about it properly, which she appreciated. He was not a man who gave approximate answers. "I miss noise," he said finally. "The house was noisy when Clara was in it, not loud but full of sound. She sang when she worked. Small songs, nothing you would recognize, just sounds she made. And there was conversation. When you live alone, you stop having conversation and you start having monologues. You talk to the horses. You go to town and people talk at you and you talk back, but it is not the same as conversation." Hazel was very still for a moment. Then she said, "I talk to Cinnamon." "Does she answer?" "She does something with her ear," Hazel said. "I have decided it means yes." He laughed and she laughed, and the sound of it went out across the creek and the willows and up into the warm afternoon, and the horses in the corral raised their heads at the sound. He took her to the 4th of July celebrations in Redemption Creek, which were modest by the standards of an eastern city, but genuine and lively by the standards of a frontier town in 1883. There were firecrackers obtained from somewhere in Mexico, a dance in the street outside the Copper Penny, a pie competition that Mrs. Dunmore won for the 4th consecutive year with a gooseberry pie that everyone agreed was extraordinary, and a horseshoe tournament that Abelardo won with the relaxed authority of a man who has never lost a horseshoe tournament in his life. Matthew introduced Hazel to everyone with a simple directness that made his feelings clear to anyone who was paying attention. He said, "This is Hazel Bell," and he said her name the way you say the name of something important, and the women of Redemption Creek, who were sharp observers of such things, exchanged looks and were pleased. Mrs. Dunmore, whose first name was Adelaide and who had been a school teacher in Ohio before coming west with her late husband, cornered Hazel near the pie table with a plate of gooseberry pie in a direct manner. "I hear you have been staying out at the Trask place," she said. "I have," said Hazel. "How does it look?" Adelaide Dunmore asked, and she was not asking about the ranch. Hazel considered. "It is coming along," she said. Adelaide Dunmore ate a forkful of her own pie and nodded. "That man has been alone too long," she said. "He is a good man. He helped me repair my roof last winter after the snow came off heavy and cracked 2 of my rafters. He came out on a Wednesday, just the 2 of them, him and Ernesto, and had it done by Friday. Would not take a cent. She looked at Hazel with clear eyes. I am glad someone finally sat down at his table who intended to stay. Hazel looked at Adelaide Dunmore and felt a warm recognition, the recognition of one plain-spoken woman for another. "So am I," she said. At the dance in the street, Matthew asked her if she would dance. She said she would. He was not a great dancer. He was too cautious in his movements on a dance floor in the same way he was very fluid on a horse, which suggested that he trusted his body in the places it had practice and was uncertain in the places it did not. She was a better dancer, and she led gently without making it obvious, and they moved through 2 reels and a slow waltz while the fiddle player, a thin old man named Cartwright who had allegedly learned to play in New Orleans, coaxed something sweet and mournful and hopeful all at once from his instrument. During the waltz, Matthew held her at the correct distance, properly, as he had said, but his hand at her back was warm and steady, and when she looked up at him, his face was very close and very serious in the way faces are during waltzes, when the music slows and the crowd falls back, and there is a brief enclosed world that is only the 2 people in it. "I am glad you sat down at my table," he said very quietly. "I am glad you made coffee," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and then he said, in a voice that was barely above a murmur, "Hazel." And she said, "I know," which was all either of them needed to say. In August, a complication arrived in the form of a man named Carter Wells. Carter Wells was the owner of the neighboring Double Hawk Ranch, which lay to the south of the Trask property and which was considerably larger. Wells was 45 years old, broad in the shoulders, with an expansive mustache and the confidence of a man who had rarely been told no. He came to the Trask Ranch on a Tuesday morning in his good suit on a good horse and asked to speak to Matthew. Hazel had been in the kitchen when he arrived, and she came to the doorway to see who had ridden up, and Wells looked at her with the particular calculating attention of a man assessing an asset that might be in play. He had come to make an offer for the East pasture land, the section that bordered Herman Johnson's farm. It was good land with reliable water access from the creek, and Wells wanted it for a price that was fair but not generous, and he presented his case with the smooth, professional manner of a man who was accustomed to getting what he came for. Matthew heard him out on the porch. Hazel stayed inside but near the door, not eavesdropping exactly but present. "I appreciate the offer," Matthew said when Wells had finished, "but the East pasture is not for sale." Wells pressed. He raised his price. He made arguments about the practicality of a smaller operation focusing its resources, about how the Trask Ranch was a good holding but perhaps spread over more ground than one man could optimally manage. Matthew was polite and firm and entirely unmoved. Wells tried a different approach. He said that he had heard Matthew had a guest staying and that he hoped all was well, and perhaps Matthew would consider bringing Miss Bell by the Double Hawk sometime so Wells could extend his hospitality. There was a pause. "Miss Bell is not a guest," Matthew said, in a voice that was very level and very clear. "She is someone I intend to ask to marry me with her consent when the time is right. I would be grateful if you would keep that in mind." There was another pause. Then Wells said, "Well, that is plain enough." He tipped his hat and rode away. In the kitchen, Hazel Bell stood very still with a dish towel in her hands. Matthew came inside. He saw her expression. He put a hand through his hair, which was not the gesture of a man who was regretful but the gesture of a man who has said an unplanned thing and is working out whether it was a mistake. "I suppose I should have asked you first," he said, "before I said that to Wells." Hazel looked at him. "Or at all yet," he added. She set down the dish towel. She looked at him with the full attention she brought to everything, and then she said, "Matthew Trask, are you actually asking me?" He looked at her for a moment, and then he clearly decided that since the situation had evolved to this point through a combination of his own stating things plainly and her remarkable capacity for sitting down at tables and staying, he might as well continue in the same direction. He crossed the kitchen. He did not get down on one knee because he was a man of the West and not a man of theatrical gesture, but he took her hands in both of his, and he looked at her directly, and he said, "Hazel Bell, I would be honored if you would consider marrying me. I cannot promise you a fine house or a society life or a great many comforts. I can promise you this land and this house, and that I will work every day to deserve the company of a woman who carries a knife and a Bible and a bottle of laudanum and repairs my porch while I am not looking. I can promise you that you would not be alone, and I can promise you that I have been more alive in the past 6 weeks than I have been in the past 3 years, and I believe that counts for something." Hazel looked at their joined hands. She looked at his face, so earnest and direct and carefully hopeful. She thought about the carved horses on the mantel, and the rosemary on the windowsill, and the creek outside, and the wide territorial sky, and the practicality of Ernesto saying he is a good man with the simple authority of direct observation. "It counts for a great deal," she said. "Yes, Matthew, I will marry you." He brought her hands to his lips and held them there for a moment, her knuckles pressed against his mouth, his eyes closed, and it was the most tender and restrained and genuine expression of feeling she had seen from him, and it undid her in the best possible way. Then he raised his head and looked at her, and there was that smile again, the one that remade his face entirely, and she thought that she was going to spend the rest of her life earning that smile, and that this was a very good way to spend a life. She wrote to her cousin Martha. Martha wrote back within 10 days with a letter so full of exclamation points that Hazel read it aloud to Matthew, and he laughed until Pigeon came in from the barn to see what was happening. They were married in the whitewashed church schoolhouse in Redemption Creek on a Saturday in September of 1883, which was golden and warm and still, the kind of September day that New Mexico Territory does better than any other place on earth. The preacher was a circuit rider named Reverend Foss, who came through the county once a month, and who married them with an economy of ceremony that suited them both. Adelaide Dunmore played the small upright piano that served for both church music and school music, and it was slightly out of tune but earnestly rendered. Abelardo and Ernesto and Pigeon were in attendance, and Pigeon cried without any apparent embarrassment about it, which endeared him to Hazel permanently. Herman Johnson came with his wife Lieselot and brought 2 loaves of bread and a jar of plum preserves, and shook Matthew's hand with the vigor of a man who has decided to forgive the wheat incident entirely. Hazel wore the best dress she had, which was a deep blue serge that she had made herself 2 years ago in Abilene, and which fit her well, and which she had pressed the night before with a flat iron borrowed from Adelaide Dunmore. She carried a small bunch of the purple sage that grew along the creek bank, tied with a white ribbon she had saved from the packet of needles in her satchel. Matthew wore his good suit, which was dark brown and not precisely fashionable, but was clean and well-fitted, and which he had pressed himself, somewhat less successfully than Hazel had pressed her dress, and which Adelaide Dunmore noted needed taking in at the shoulders, and which she would address at a later date with her needle and thread and uninvited expertise. When Reverend Foss asked if anyone present knew any reason these two should not be joined and waited the traditional moment of silence, Matthew looked at Hazel, and Hazel looked at Matthew, and the moment of silence was filled, at least for the two of them, with 6 weeks of mornings and cattle roundups and porch repairs and creekside conversations, and a 4th of July dance, and the solid accumulating weight of 2 people who have decided to build something together. "I do," said Reverend Foss to the question he had put to them, and they repeated their vows in clear voices, and the church schoolhouse was full of the kind of feeling that fills a room when something right is happening. When he kissed her at the end of it, it was brief and warm and real, with his hands on both sides of her face, and she heard Pigeon make a sound that was definitively a sob and Ernesto patting him on the back consolingly. They went home to the ranch that evening, just the two of them, as husband and wife, and the house received them the way a house receives people who are meant to be in it. The fire was already laid, Ernesto having come ahead to see to it. The rosemary on the windowsill was blooming a small purple flower that neither of them had noticed before. The light in the kitchen was the warm orange of a September evening, and Matthew lit the lamp and set it on the table, and they stood in the kitchen together for a moment, this man and this woman in this house, and the rightness of it was something that did not need to be said. The first winter of their marriage was the kind of winter that teaches you about a person. It was not as severe as the winter of 1880 that Matthew had described, but it was cold enough and long enough, and there were 2 weeks in January when a norther blew down from Colorado, and the temperature dropped to places that made working outside a matter of layers and stubbornness, and the mutual determination not to let the other person do the hard parts alone. They worked side by side in those weeks, feeding the cattle when the grass was locked under ice, breaking the creek ice for water, hauling hay from the barn that Matthew had had the foresight to stack full the previous autumn. Hazel learned things about cattle in the cold that you cannot learn in the summer, and Matthew learned things about Hazel that you can only learn in the specific revelatory intimacy of a shared struggle. She was stronger than she looked, which he had already known. She was also stubborn in a way that was not stubbornness for its own sake, but the deep, purposeful stubbornness of someone who has decided a thing and will see it through. She did not complain, and she did not dramatize. She also, he discovered, had an unexpectedly wicked sense of humor that showed up in the evenings when the hardest work was done, and they were sitting by the fire, and she would say something so precisely dry and accurate about the day's events that he would laugh so suddenly that he startled himself. She also cried, once, when a calf died in the second week of January despite everything they had done to save it. She had not expected to cry about a calf. She stood in the barn in the lamplight with the small dead thing and cried quickly and efficiently, and then wiped her face and said, "All right, what do we do with the mother?" Because the cow would need to be redirected to another calf or she would grieve herself lean, and there was practical work to be done. Matthew had watched her cry without saying anything because he understood instinctively that she was not asking to be consoled. She was simply having a feeling and letting it be had, and then she was going to work. But he put his hand on her back for a moment before she turned to the cow, and she leaned into it briefly, and that was sufficient. She planted the garden in the spring. The patch of dry ground on the south side of the house that had been abandoned for 3 years, she reclaimed with a methodical ferocity that Ernesto watched from a respectful distance. And by April she had turned and amended the soil and planted beans and squash and tomatoes, and in a long row along the fence, a variety of herbs that she had obtained from Abelardo's wife Consuela, who maintained an extensive and carefully tended herb garden behind her house in town. Matthew put up a proper fence around the garden so the chickens could not get in, and he built it with the same careful patience he brought to all physical work. And when Hazel saw the finished fence, she ran her hand along the top rail and said, "This is fine work, Matthew." "I had a good reason to do it well," he said. In May, Hazel discovered she was with child. She was not entirely surprised and she was not alarmed, but she was quiet for a day while she held the knowledge inside herself and looked at it from different angles. The following evening she told Matthew, straightforwardly, sitting across from him at the pine table where she had first sat down on the day they met. Matthew's face went through several expressions very quickly. The first was pure shock. The second was something that might have been a held breath of wonder. The third was that open and unguarded happiness that she had decided was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He came around the table and crouched down beside her chair and took her face in his hands exactly the way he had when he kissed her at their wedding, with his full attention and his full feeling. "Hazel," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you well?" He asked, meaning it in the largest possible sense. "I am very well," she said. "I am the best I have been in a very long time." He leaned forward and she put her arms around his neck, and they stayed like that for a long moment in the kitchen, with the evening coming in through the window and the smell of the garden coming in with it, and the rosemary on the windowsill blooming its small purple flowers again, faithful and returning. The pregnancy was not easy, but it was not dramatic. Hazel was practical about it the way she was practical about everything. She continued to work in the garden and help with the lighter ranch tasks, and ride Chestnut at a gentle pace through the second month and into the third. When Matthew asked her quietly and without pressure if she thought perhaps the riding might be reduced a little, and she agreed that yes, perhaps it might. Adelaide Dunmore became a frequent visitor to the ranch during this period, which was a development that pleased Hazel greatly, because Adelaide was sharp and funny, and had been a schoolteacher, and had opinions about everything from the territorial legislature to the best method for preserving tomatoes, and conversation with her was never predictable and never dull. Adelaide also, quietly and without announcement, organized the women of Redemption Creek to make a quilt. It was presented to Hazel in July by a delegation of 6 women who arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon with the quilt in a paper parcel and a great deal of cake. And it was made in a pattern called the Flying Geese, in blues and greens and the deep amber of the territorial earth. And it was the most beautiful thing Hazel had been given in many years, and she said so without any ceremony, and the 6 women were very pleased. The boy was born in November of 1884, strong and loud, and indignant about the transition from one world to the next. The midwife was Consuela, Abelardo's wife, who had delivered half the children in the county and was calm and competent, and who said, when the whole business was done, and the baby was washed and wrapped and in his mother's arms, that she had not had an easier birth in 6 months. Hazel lay in the bed in the room that had been a guest room and held the baby against her chest, and felt the radical disorientation of a love she had not known was possible, large and immediate and without condition, the way creeks run, without asking permission. Matthew came in. He had been sent out of the room during the final hours, and he had spent the time in a state of barely controlled anxiety that Pigeon had managed by talking to him continuously about a variety of topics, none of them relevant, which Pigeon seemed to understand was the correct strategy. He came in and Consuela stepped back and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Hazel and the baby, and the look on his face was the most complicated thing she had seen on any human face, grief and joy and love and relief and something else. The something else that is only available to people who have been alone a long time and then are suddenly, fully, not alone. He looks like you, Hazel said. Matthew looked at the baby carefully. The baby had his dark hair and a very serious expression which was somewhat impressive in a creature 6 minutes old. What shall we call him? Matthew asked. Hazel had thought about this. I thought Thomas, she said, for your father if you would like, the man who carved the horses. Matthew was quiet for a moment. Then he said Thomas, tasting the name, finding it right. Yes, Thomas. He put his hand out and touched his son's cheek with one finger, very gently, as if the baby were something precious and also unaccountably real. And Thomas Trask, 6 minutes old, turned his head toward the touch with the instinctive certainty of new life finding warmth. The years that followed were full years. Redemption Creek grew a little, as frontier towns did in the 80s, gaining a proper school when the church schoolhouse arrangement finally became untenable, and the town raised money for a dedicated building, and a doctor named Dr. Pruitt, who came from Pennsylvania, and who was young and earnest and slightly overwhelmed by the variety of things that happened to people in the territories, but who was learning fast. Matthew expanded the cattle operation carefully, adding 100 head over 2 years and hiring a 3rd permanent hand, a quiet Navajo man named James Runningwater, who had experience with cattle and horses that went beyond anything any of the other hands had, and who was treated by Matthew with the straightforward respect he extended to anyone who could do their work with skill. Hazel noticed the care Matthew took with this, the way he was matter-of-fact about James's wages being the same as Ernesto's, the way he shut down a comment from a passing drover in town with a single-level look that required no words. The territories were full of injustice against the Navajo and Apache and Pueblo peoples, old injustices compounded by new ones, the reservation system and the land seizures and the daily small brutalities. And Matthew Trask was not a man who could fix the world, but he was a man who could be correct within the boundaries of what he could control. James stayed with the Trask Ranch for 7 years, and then went to work on his own land, a small parcel near the reservation boundary that he had been saving for, and Matthew helped him file the paperwork and stood beside him when a land agent in Santa Fe tried to make the process difficult. And this was not a dramatic story with a villain brought to justice, but it was a true story about the way one decent person can make a specific difference in a specific life. Hazel started teaching reading and arithmetic to the children of the ranch hands, and eventually to several children in the neighboring homesteads, using the kitchen table on Thursday afternoons, which evolved into a regular arrangement that Adelaide Dunmore formally recognized by providing Hazel with a set of McGuffey readers and a box of chalk and the title of assistant teacher, which carried no salary, but which Hazel did not need a salary for since she taught because she believed in it. Thomas grew. He was a serious and curious child who asked questions with a persistence that Matthew recognized as coming from his mother, and which he admired enormously even when it was directed at him at inconvenient moments. He could ride at 3, which everyone agreed was early but not surprising given his parents. He learned to read before he started at the proper school because Hazel had been teaching him at the kitchen table long before the Thursday classes began. A second child came in the spring of 1887, a girl they named Clara Rosemary, and the name was chosen with the full weight of what it carried, the honoring of a person who had been loved and who had given her name to a rosemary plant on a windowsill that was still growing 12 years after she had planted it. Matthew held his daughter for the first time with the tears running freely down his face, which was the only time Hazel had ever seen him cry, and she did not say anything about it. She only sat up in the bed and put her hand on his arm and let him have the feeling. Clara Rosemary was everything her brother was not, loud and physical and fearless, and tremendously confident in her own opinions from approximately the age of 14 months, which is to say she was, in several respects, her mother's daughter. She could outrode Thomas within 6 months of learning to ride, and she had a talent for mimicry that she demonstrated at the dinner table to the helpless amusement of her parents and the resigned suffering of Pigeon, who was a frequent target. On an evening in the autumn of 1889, when Thomas was 5 and Clara was 2 and the harvest had been good, and the cattle drive to Las Vegas had gone well, and the first cold breath of fall was coming down from the mountains, Hazel and Matthew sat on the porch in the 2 wooden chairs that had been replaced twice since that first evening but which always stood in the same place, and the stars came up the way they did in the territory, all at once and uncompromisingly. Matthew had his hand over hers on the arm of her chair, easy and warm and habitual, the way you hold the hand of someone you have held it so long that not holding it would be the unusual thing. "Do you ever think about Santa Fe?" he asked. This was a question he had asked before, not in anxiety but in genuine curiosity, the way you ask a person about the roads not taken with the confidence of someone who has no doubt about the road that was taken. "Sometimes," she said honestly. "I wonder what the boarding house was like. I wonder what Martha's life there is. I am glad I write to her." "And," he said. She looked out at the dark valley and the creek's faint silver below and the wide arc of the stars above. "And I am exactly where I am meant to be," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers properly, fingers linked. "I think about the day you walked up those steps," he said. "I told you the house was no good for decent company. I was fully prepared for you to turn around and walk back to town." "I know," she said. "What made you sit down?" he asked. He had asked this before. He liked the answer. She thought about it as she always did genuinely, even though she had told the story several times. "I had walked 2 miles in the heat with a lame horse," she said. And I looked at the house and I saw that someone had once cared about it and that the caring was still there underneath the neglect, waiting. And I looked at you and I saw the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "And the coffee helped," she said, which made him laugh. "The coffee was terrible," he said. "It was dreadful," she agreed cheerfully. "But it was offered and that counts." He raised her hand and kissed her knuckles, the way he had done on the day she accepted his proposal. His eyes closed, and then he opened his eyes and looked at her in the starlight, and she looked back. "Hazel Bell Trask," he said. "Matthew Trask," she said. The cottonwoods were turning gold along the creek below. Inside the house, Thomas and Clara were asleep in their beds under the flying geese quilt, because it had been big enough for 2 children, as Adelaide Dunmore had perhaps intended when she organized the making of it. The rosemary on the kitchen windowsill was in its evening shadow. The carved horses on the mantel stood in their perpetual gallop over the cold stone. Pigeon was somewhere in the bunkhouse telling a story to Ernesto and James about the cattle drive of 1885 and a river crossing that had become, in Pigeon's telling, more legendary with each successive year. Consuela would be at her house in town, where her herb garden was wrapped in its autumn stillness. Adelaide Dunmore would be reading at her kitchen table by the lamp. Herman Johnson's wheat was harvested and stacked, and his farm was solid and warm in the valley. Abelardo's livery stable was quiet. Cinnamon, who had lived to a good old age and who had spent the last 6 years in a pasture where no one asked anything of her but that she exist and be a horse, was in the barn, her white muzzle a little more white than it had been in Redemption Creek 7 years ago. The world was big and difficult and full of injustice and hardship, and the long territorial night was cold, and the ranch was small against the size of the country, and none of that was untrue. But here on this porch, in this chair, with this man's hand in hers, Hazel Bell Trask felt the full and specific weight of a life that had found its right shape, the way water finds its level, the way hardy plants come back to bloom, the way a person who has been moving for a very long time finally, fully, stops. She leaned her head back in the chair and looked up at the stars. He looked at her looking at the stars. This was everything, and they knew it. And they stayed until the cold drove them inside. And then they went into the house together and closed the door on the night. And the fire was warm and the children were sleeping. And the lamp was lit on the table where a woman had once set down her satchel and sat down without being asked, and said that she had seen rougher and meant it and stayed.